Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Tia Mitchell, here with Patricia Murphy. Over the next few months, voters in the South will choose a new generation of governors. Georgia is one of 5 southern states with an open governor's race in November, and whoever wins those races will inherit some of the same enormous questions. How aggressively should states compete for new industries? Who should pay for the infrastructure these new industries require, and how much political influence in the South will translate into actual results. Today, we're going to look beyond a single campaign to ask a bigger question. Is political power in America shifting southward? And what does that mean for Georgia? Today, we have Howard Franklin, the founder and CEO of Ohio River South, which we'll learn more about in just a few minutes. He's a longtime Democratic strategist, a close advisor to Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens, and the author of the new regional report, Accelerating South: Risks, Rewards, and the Roads Ahead. Howard, welcome to Politically Georgia.
Thank you for having me back. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for coming. And so let's start. I know you've been on the show before, but just to refresh people's memories, because Ohio River South, I think, is known for being that firm with close ties to the city of Atlanta and its mayors. But you've been really working to move the influence of Ohio River South beyond just Atlanta. So can you just briefly tell us a little bit about the firm and the work you guys do?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the work that the firm does is what informed the report. We do a lot of advocacy, not only across jurisdictional lines in the state of Georgia or in our hometown of Atlanta, but we have several clients we work for in a multi-state capacity. So I can name a bunch of corporations. I'm not going to do that for you now, but a number of organizations are interested in seeing their influence really multiply across multiple jurisdictions. And they see oftentimes that what happens in Mississippi or Alabama might also pop up in Tennessee or in Georgia. So having a regional lens has been really effective for many of our clients as they are looking to either change regulatory regimes. They might be trying to make something more permissive or make something maybe prohibited. They also are working on traditional legislative advocacy. Oftentimes we help them do business with government. So it might be, how do we meet the right folks? How do we understand what the priorities are or how they might be changing? And then eventually we oftentimes get to a place where we're just trying to raise the level of awareness and discussion on an issue set. So all those are things that happen not just in a vacuum, not just in the capital city of the South, but also all across the region.
And you do have offices now in D.C., in Atlanta. And of course, you have this new report that we want to talk to you about today. So you make a really big argument at the beginning of the report, and you say the South is no longer playing catch up with the rest of the country. It is one of the places that determines where the country goes next. What convinces you that that is an accurate statement? What have you seen around the country that makes you believe that political power is shifting to the South?
Yeah, there's so many data points that really underscore this conclusion. Honestly, I was surprised that more publications hadn't arrived at it on their own. I think Bloomberg Businessweek had done a couple pieces when the GDP of how they define the South eclipsed the GDP of the Northeast. And that was a big story, but that was back in 2023. And a lot of it was driven by migration patterns changing post-pandemic and people moving to places that are warmer climates, less expensive housing, lower taxes, et cetera. But there are so many other really great top lines. One of those is that 725 corporations relocated their headquarters to what we're considering the 9-state South in 2025, more than any other region in the country. For a long time, the South has been one of the fastest growing parts of the country, and last census confirmed it. The top 5 metros by remigration patterns are all in what you would consider the traditional South. One of the things that really struck me, there was an interesting data point to go to your question, Tia, is that the federal government is more Southern than ever. And in the report, we actually do, for each of the 9 states, a power players ranking. And we name folks who came from each of those states, what their pet issues might be, where they sit in the federal apparatus. They might be majority or minority leaders. They might be appointees to important and powerful agencies. They might be advisors to the president or to key members of Congress, for instance. But this is in recent memory, I don't think we've had a more southern concentration of power, right? You've got, even at the legislative level, you can look at the fact you've got the House Speaker and the Majority Leader from the same state. Never has happened before. But there are a bunch of others. When your readers and your listeners check out the report at accelerating.south.com, you'll see for each of the states.
Well, I think also when you talk about corporations relocating, that means people are relocating to the South, which means power is relocating to the South. And when you look at those migration patterns, Georgia's had more than 500,000 new residents just since 2020. And when we get to 2030 for the new census, I think everybody is expecting a significant redistribution of literally power from what we consider kind of like the big power states, New York, California, Illinois. That's going to start to look a lot less powerful compared to Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina. What do you think all of that means, because it truly will literally redistribute power to where we are?
You took the words out of my mouth, Patricia, and not only you're making exactly the right point, but the power centers that we've traditionally thought of, those regional power centers, are also places that are losing population. We've heard California, New York in particular, losing to Miami and to Florida in particular, especially around these technology companies. One thing worth noting, as people migrate, companies do too. They are looking for their talent pool. They are looking for their customers. They're looking for so much, and that's how they're following. But we held off on making the reapportionment argument for this report. We figured it'll be good for next year, in large part because of all the reapportionment changes, or I would like to call them shenanigans over the last several months.
Fair.
But next year, for sure, when we reissue the second year of this report, we will talk a lot about how many more Electoral College votes are going to come to these states in advance of the 2028 presidential election, and when we'll have an open presidency. So yes, 100%, those population, those changes are going to have meaningful and lasting impacts on how and where power goes. And as you guys know, covering the federal government, where those population centers are and where those numbers of stronger delegations are is where leadership posts will grow and where folks from leadership will decide to reach even higher office. So a ton of great things happening in this part of the country.
So, Howard, and we are going to get into some non-report questions because we can't have you here and only focus on one topic. But I thought it was interesting in the report. You took one issue that's kind of at the center of a lot of debate, and that's the rise of data centers, the construction of data centers. And rather than just saying, Republicans want this, Democrats want that, you really say that states are beginning to regulate. The divide is there are states that are beginning to regulate the industry and states that are trying to accommodate more growth in the industry.
True.
And tell us, I'm sure your work has informed that, and some of the big companies you represent are companies that are looking to build data centers. But again, you work a lot with local governments that are trying to navigate this. So just tell us more about how you landed on that political divide of regulation versus growth.
Yeah, again, it was the numbers. We saw Virginia, I think, as the state that's passed the most data center regulations in a single legislative session. They did so after electing the first woman governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and one of the few Democrats in this part of the country who's presiding over, in this case, the less hostile legislature than some of the other Democrats who've been elected and have much more hostile General Assemblies to deal with. But the long and short was 15 bills came out of Virginia. I want to say Georgia proposed upwards of a dozen bills, but none of them actually made it across the finish line. Unlike in years past, I think we had one or two bills that made it to the governor's desk and were vetoed. So what you have here is exactly this sorting, and it's why Metro Atlanta is the number 2 market for data centers. It's the fastest growing market for data centers, and there's a lot of corollaries that we've had to study between Northern Virginia and Metro Atlanta. And I think there is a fomenting regulatory regime coming to the fore. It hasn't congealed yet, but I do think there's a lot of discussion about, where community benefits agreements are and, use of water and power resources, how they're treated by utilities, large, low customers, et cetera. So I think we're still a couple years out from something that looks uniform. But in the meantime, the folks who are going to push those regulations off a little bit further are still sending their economic development teams and cutting ribbons on billion-dollar economic development projects like Georgia, like Mississippi, like South Carolina.
It seems like part of the attraction for corporations is that a lot of the southern states are just simply more friendly to corporations. It's lower tax generally. For individual corporate leaders, there can be no income taxes. In Texas and Florida, I think we know that that's why a number of large companies have relocated, because their rich guys can get richer. I think also it's a much lower concentration of union power. Are those structures, do you think, going to remain in place and continue to attract businesses even as populations continue to come here? And there may be some frustration in large urban areas that's why they're coming here. And is there a time to sort of recenter or rethink some of the policies that brought those companies here? I guess I'm asking, will there be a backlash in these southern states at some point?
Yeah, that's a great question. So much of this is a response to what you just described. And I think if you look back at this, you're talking about structure. And it used to be that the structural advantages of the Northeast, of the great Pacific Northwest, where you had real capital, you had talent, you had people who were willing to invest in innovation, you had higher education, et cetera. I think the story that I see is the South catching up on a number of those indices without the regulatory framework that is, a little bit anathema to corporations. So you still have a Georgia Tech, you still got an Emory or UGA or Georgia State, you got the AUC, but you also have all sorts of technology investment. You've got innovation labs. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, it seemed like that was kind of the soup du jour. Shortly after the pandemic, there were innovation labs being announced all over Metro Atlanta, all over Georgia, and all over the region. So really what you see is a little bit of a rebalancing where you've got these other infrastructural benefits, but without the regulatory overlay.
So now let's take it away from the report. I got to get into some of the other things going on. And we mentioned in the intro, you are a close advisor to Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens. You were there with him first time, the second time, much easier. He didn't have huge roadblocks winning a second term in office. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think he has to address in this second term? What are some of the bigger things to do, hard things to do on his list for this second term in order for it to be a success?
That's a great question. And I can answer this almost 2 different ways. I mean, he's already made it clear that he wants to address historic and long-standing inequality in the city. The neighborhood revitalization initiative is something that he has been campaigning on, that he has been investing in, that he has been talking about and making the moves to make real across the city. So I think he's already scored a meaningful victory with getting the Atlanta City Council to pass a version of this proposal. I know that a number of the folks there are hard at work talking to Atlanta Public Schools, Fulton County Commission about doing the exact same thing and continue to invest in the things that make Atlanta one of the best places to live. I want to say, I think The Economist said we were number 2 as of yesterday or last week, place to live. So I know that, a number of the quality of life issues, a number of the investment issues about how this city shows up. I think even as we're, cruising toward the final match day in Atlanta for FIFA World Cup, I know when he created the organization as really promoting local business and small business as partners here, the thing that he likes to say with Showcase Atlanta is we didn't want FIFA World Cup to happen to Atlanta, but with Atlanta. And I think this is very much a through line in his leadership, even, predating his time on council or becoming mayor. If you're asking the tougher question, what things need to happen, I think a lot of it is in this report. A lot of it is the headwinds of the federal government. I think we were very concerned initially about de-investment or disinvestment for some of the major projects. Like we still want to figure out what's going to happen to the Stitch, and that was $150-ish million that was committed to the city from the federal government that was effectively clawed back. We got to figure out how we can re-empower the CDC and continue to keep public health at the forefront of policy debates and things that are taking place here in the state and in the region. region. There's a discussion that's finally bubbled to the surface about coming up with a new hospital on the south of I-20 and public health. It probably doesn't get as much attention as it deserves, and I know its purview sits within the county, but this mayor, this administration has jumped in front of it, and with or without federal partners, I know they're making the efforts to try to bring a hospital to life on the south side of the city. So there are a number of things that the administration can declare as priorities, as initiatives, but then we've got to go, do what he's always talking about, pull together the group project and get enough people pulling in the same direction to make big things happen for the city. I think that's been the mantra, and I don't think that's going to change for the remainder of his time.
It seems like he has had a real success being both a kind of a champion for the more impoverished sections of the cities while also being a partner to business. I don't know if that's because he went to Georgia Tech and he came out of the business world. He just seems to have been able to build bridges between those two groups. And it seems like it could be a lesson for statewide Democrats as they're messaging. And you talk about your report for Ohio River South. Most of the southern states are run by Republicans who are very friendly to corporations, very friendly to business, and really make it an effort to go out and attract those businesses, bring them here. That doesn't happen by accident. What do you think what does it look like if Keisha Lance Bottoms wins the governor's race and Democrats are then in charge of the state? What do you think the business reaction would be? And sort of, can you give some little advice to a Bottoms administration when it comes to businesses?
Well, one, I'll do it as quickly as I can. I think Mayor Dickens has had a phenomenal, successful track record in large part because neighborhoods across the city want the same thing, right? And if you can, I think he proved at the outset of his first term, if I can bring down crime, if I can make people feel more safe, if I can get kids opportunity to come off the streets and not to commit petty, property crimes, but to join the workforce, to learn skill sets. And I can also get the corporations whose names, light up the skyline in the city of Atlanta, a pipeline of new technology adjacent workforces who can go into these buildings, who can come up with new innovations, who can, create new companies, et cetera. And I think he's found a really great nexus for a number of the issues that really matter to the city and to the to corporations and to the affluent parts of the city as well. But I think that is exactly what you need from the next governor.
Do you think there's a chance that one of the Democrats running statewide, besides John Ossoff, has a chance of winning, whether it's Mayor Bottoms or Josh McLaurin or, Democrats have candidates up and down the ballot for all of these statewide offices. Do you think they can do it this year?
Yeah, it's a great question. Not to take us back to the report, but there's a section here that talks about the seesaw that is Georgia and how in 2020, you had President Biden win the state before you seesaw back to Donald Trump in 2024. Or in 2021 with Ossoff and Warnock, you had Democrats winning there before you had a little bit of a drought with Republicans retaining seats in 2022. Or even Warnock winning when Brian Kemp and all of the executive officers statewide also won. So there's a real seesaw, and it almost dissuades you from expecting that past performance would be the best determinant of future performance. So it's hard to say. I mean, I think that there's a lot of unity on the Democratic side. I think I ran into someone this morning who was jazzed at the UPS store about the ticket and the diversity, the messaging, et cetera. I think we're very much in uncharted territory. I don't think any of us really know what kind of money Rick Jackson intends to spend in a governor's race. If he spends $100 million to win a primary, I mean, what do you spend to win a general election? I got to imagine the answer is more. I can remember all the years that we have complained about how many TV commercials we have to suffer through, and I got to imagine this year we're going to beat that record, whatever it was. But yeah, I absolutely think there's an opportunity, and a lot of it is driven by the guy, at the center of Washington, D.C. I think as long as Trump is kind of, meandering about without a ton of, foresight, I think if gas prices continue rising, I think if we keep getting into unnecessary wars, if, there's rancor amongst even Senate Republicans right now, I can't imagine that he won't keep giving Democrats an opportunity to go out and win more votes.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Howard Franklin, thanks for returning. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. If you have a question you'd like to ask us here on the Politically Georgia podcast, you can call our call-in hotline anytime, leave a question, and we'll play it back and answer it on the show during the Monday mailbag segment. The number is 770-810-5297. That's 770-810-5297. We can't wait to hear from you. So, Patricia, we just talked to Howard Franklin. I want to make sure our readers know, he is not an elected official, so people might not hear his name all the time, but he has a lot of influence, not just in City Hall, not just in the Gold Dome, but particularly in Metro Atlanta. These elected officials lean on Howard. He has their ear. He is behind the scenes, super involved in the way government works in Metro Atlanta.
Yeah, he's also really helpful for us to talk to because he doesn't just have visibility into the mayor's office, into other Democratic campaigns, and even congressional offices for the Democrats. He also has a lot of visibility into the business community because those are his clients for the most part. And we're able to get a really broad view of the landscape for Democrats here in the state of Georgia. And obviously, as we just heard, regionally across the South, as the South is becoming much more influential in terms of business, in terms of population, and now in terms of politics, somebody like Howard is a great resource for us to have a better understanding of what that means for Democrats as it stands now and what Democrats are trying to do to build their influence in the South. And that really, for us, obviously starts not just in Atlanta, but statewide here in Georgia as well.
Yeah. And I did find the report, his Accelerating South report, really interesting because it does kind of take the 9 southern states and think about some of the through lines, the fact that so many of the southern states do have open governor's races, which means new leadership that could take states in new direction. But he also talks about some of the unique things in each state. And when it comes to Georgia in this governor's race, all the statewide races, but kind of top of the ticket besides Senator Ossoff is this governor's race. And I did think it was interesting when we talked to Howard about the possibility of divided government. Depending on how strong Senator Ossoff does, depending on President Trump's popularity, there is a chance Keisha Lance Bottoms could become governor, but it would be really hard for Democrats to flip the House and the Senate. They're just coming from too far behind, so to speak, to get the number of seats they would need, which means we could have a Democrat governor, but with the legislature that has a lot of power in Georgia, the lieutenant governor, if he is a Republican, a lot of power to set the agenda in the Gold Dome. And what could that mean in how our state runs during those, 2 or 4 years of divided government?
Yeah, it's so fascinating to hear Howard's perspective on this governor's race as distinct from Senator Ossoff's race in the Senate. Ossoff right now is so well positioned in terms of the huge amounts of money that he's raised, his really relatively high approval rating here in the state of Georgia for an incumbent, and the really low popularity of President Trump statewide. That's making Jon Ossoff just come off as immensely formidable in a state where he has been described across the country as the most vulnerable Democrat in the country because he's the only Democrat running for re-election in a state that President Trump won. So Ossoff is incredibly well positioned. But then you get to the governor's race. It's a really different, distinct race because it's an open race. There's no incumbent. And the prospect of having a governor, it's a different conversation. It's not just about President Trump. It's not just about being a check and a balance to President Trump as Ossoff is framing his race. Keisha Lance Bottoms has to have a really different conversation with voters in order to convince them that she's the right person for the job. But the fact that Ossoff is doing so well, that will provide some pretty significant tailwinds for Keisha Lance Bottoms. And so the possibility of a Mayor Bottoms becoming Governor Bottoms is very real. And I think that's something that we heard there. But the chance of this being a Democratic state, like run by Democrats, that's not going to happen in 2026. Yeah. That's very clear. Yeah. And so it does also outline if Bottoms were to win, she'd have a ton of work ahead of her, because you're going to have Republican General Assembly that is not going to be looking to change the state entirely the way her campaign has proposed on a number of issues, very large policy issues that they've really resisted.
And she's going to have to build relationships. You know, she famously did not have a great relationship with Governor Kemp during her 4 years as mayor. And at least on the outside looking in, it didn't seem like either side really worked on the relationship. And that's something when Andre Dickens became mayor, that was a big selling point, that he did work on that relationship and worked on having better communications, better lines of the communications with the governor's office. Now, if Bottoms becomes the governor, but it's still your relationships with all these Republicans who run things, you know, around the state and our leaders and the various committees and things like that, like these Republicans of influence, does she work to build these relationships knowing that she can't get a lot done without them and vice versa? Or does she kind of go at her own by executive order or grabbing power wherever she can and just, you know, hope she can drag them along? Would be a really interesting to see what approach should that happen.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And obviously, again, we have to restate this is a hypothetical. We don't know that Mayor Bottoms is going to win the governor's race. But if she did, we look to her time as mayor, and I think she was much better known for the fights that she had with Republicans, with Governor Kemp, with President Trump. She almost made her name for the city standing up against the Republicans and what they were doing. And a lot of times those became very ugly and personal fights, especially between her and Governor Kemp. Is that the kind of governor that we would expect her to be when it comes to working with Republicans here in the state? I think that's an open question. I do know that here in the state, though, the governor of Georgia has immense powers as it stands right now. The governor appoints, obviously, all of the agency heads, appoints members to the dozens and dozens of boards here in the state that have tons of influence over policy, regulations, decision-making. If Bottoms were to win, I think we could certainly expect a Republican legislature, as long as it stays that way, and we would generally expect it to try and trim her powers significantly in a special session if she were to win, and really change the nature of that governor's seat going into her own administration. So it sort of opens up this possibility of the government of the state of Georgia looking very, very different than it has in the last many years, because typically the Republican governors have worked hand in hand with the Republican legislatures, with some notable exceptions, but it's been typically a team sport down at the Georgia Capitol for the last many years.
So I want to ask you, as we kind of wrap this thing up, what are you seeing as you're closer to the ground than I am here in D.C. from these two candidates for governor? Because to me, again, from D.C., they're not as active as they were in the closing days of the primary and the runoff. Why do you think that is? Or am I just reading it wrong because I'm not there?
Yeah, I don't think you're reading it wrong. I think that both campaigns of Rick Jackson and Keisha Lance Bottoms have taken this time in the summer, sort of like the doldrums of summer, when people have sort of stopped paying attention to politics. In fact, are begging not to have to pay attention to politics right now. We see them beefing up their staffs. We see them sort of resetting for the campaign ahead, the general election. They're going to have such different races on their hands compared to the primaries that they just ran. We have seen Rick Jackson come out. The first public stops that he did were very different from his primary campaign. He went to a Mexican restaurant in Doraville. He went to a Black-owned barbershop south of Atlanta, and really setting the tone for his general election campaign that it is more broad-based, more focused on minority voters, trying to do more outreach than he did in that GOP primary. And I think that is a significant reset that we should pay attention to and we'll see a lot more of. Keisha Lance Bottoms' main public events have been with Jon Ossoff since she won her, she was going to win her nomination anyway. I think that was pretty clear. But since they became that ticket, they have immediately become sort of a tag team. The only rallies she's done have been with Jon Ossoff as the headliner. And so I think going forward to November, it will be fascinating to see if she kind of continues to sort of being that tag team package deal that they're offering for voters, or does she start to have her own distinct vision and promises for the state? Rick Jackson is clearly going out on his own. He has not been campaigning with Mike Collins. It doesn't mean that they won't campaign together, but Rick Jackson has been really working to establish his political brand since he's such a newcomer and start to tell Georgia voters, I'm more than what you saw in the primary, and you're going to start to see more and more of that as November comes.
Yeah. And I think what's the difference is Congressman Mike Collins and Senator Ossoff, they're both in D.C. They're casting votes. They have records that they're running on. Ossoff, you and I both know, almost once a day, he's putting out a press release highlighting some federal funding he got for a program or an entity or a city in Georgia. You know, he's doing his official side, which helps get eyeballs, you know, that earned media, so to speak, even if he isn't doing a campaign event. And the same thing for Mike Collins, maybe to a smaller degree, but he is in Washington. You know, I'm interviewing him for News of the Day. He's still getting a certain degree of earned media just by being an active member of Congress. And I think Rick Jackson it seems like he's responded to that by saying, you know what, I can't just disappear. I'm still doing campaign events. But it doesn't seem, again, on the outside looking in, that Keisha Lance Bottoms has responded in the same way to Ossoff. So it's like Ossoff has these rallies. She's been there. Ossoff is doing his thing in the Senate, but it just doesn't seem yet like her campaign is finding a way to do its thing. But maybe to your point, she is staffing up behind the scenes. She knows it's kind of slow. People are on vacation, and she's planning to ramp up closer to Election Day. I think we'll see how the strategy plays out.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing from Democrats that they want to see from the campaign, the Bottoms campaign that they haven't yet, is that they have a plan to build an infrastructure to flip this state and not rely on Jon Ossoff and his Senate campaign to just do that, or rely on a coordinated campaign to just do that. They really want to see Bottoms leaning into leading this ticket, having her own plan, having her own identity, and having a significant infrastructure for Democrats to be able to rely on.
Yeah.
Because it's a heavy lift for Georgia Democrats to think about winning the governor's race. And they want to see from the Bottoms campaign that they understand that. They've got a plan for it. They got the money for it. They've got the energy for it. I don't think they've seen that yet, and that's what they're looking for.
Yeah, well, we're waiting to see it too. That's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. Now, if you found us on YouTube, welcome to our channel. And please click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. If you love what you hear, the best way to support us is by subscribing to the AJC. Your subscription keeps this show on the air, and it hooks you up with full access to our reporting, exclusive newsletters, event invites, and article gifting for your friends. Start your subscription right now at ajc.com/start. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia. And we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.